Welcome back, everyone, to the most intense, brutal, and merciless developments on the global geopolitical chessboard, right here on the War Satellite Channel. Dear viewers, for 8 long decades, since the ashes of World War II settled, America's absolute dominance wasn't built on empty diplomatic promises. It rested on the towering silhouettes of its supercarriers slicing through every ocean on Earth. These floating fortresses symbolized untouchable deterrence, mobile territories packed with apocalyptic firepower, capable of flattening any nation that dared challenge Washington's world order. Yet history has a way of humbling those drowning in arrogance. Today, humanity has been violently shaken from its unipolar dream by the most terrifying shock in modern naval history. The blood-soaked curtain has risen over the Middle East cauldron, revealing a nightmarish reality. Two U.S. Navy supercarriers, including the $13 billion pride of the fleet, the USS Gerald R. Ford, were not merely hit, they were shattered, torn apart, and completely vaporized from the waters of the Persian Gulf. The world's greatest superpower has suffered a catastrophic strike that claimed thousands of sailors' lives and permanently expelled America from the Middle East quagmire, leaving behind an indelible stain of eternal shame. Join us as we rewind to the Arabian Sea and the strategic Strait of Hormuz, just hours before the tragedy unfolded. Pentagon war planners had confidently deployed two massive carrier strike groups into the region as a steel ultimatum to the Tehran-Moscow axis. Their reasoning was pure hubris. With over 150 stealth F-35Cs and the advanced Aegis combat system on escort cruisers, they believed they had created an impenetrable shield. They stared at satellite maps, convinced that controlling these maritime choke points would strangle Iran's economy and send an icy warning to every proxy force in the area. In Washington's opulent hallways, metal-laden generals boasted that gunboat diplomacy had once again succeeded. They had turned the narrow waters of the Gulf into their own private lake for the Fifth Fleet. They mistook the enemy's eerie silence for fear and submission. But pride is the fastest poison to strategic thinking. America had no idea that from the moment those 100,000-ton steel behemoths entered the kill zone near the Zagros Mountains, they had willingly walked into a deadly trap meticulously prepared by the sharpest strategic minds in the East. The trap didn't begin with loud declarations of war. It opened with masterful cyber deception and electronic warfare on a colossal scale. While American destroyers lazily swept the skies with their phased array radars in an invisible dimension, a terrifying quantum-level jamming network powered by Russian Krasuka 4 and Murmansk BN systems quietly supplied to Iran roared to life from deep inland. In less than 5 seconds, the eyes and ears of both carrier strike groups went completely blind and deaf. Radar screens in the USS Gerald R. Ford's Combat Information Center flooded with thousands of phantom signals before dissolving into pure white noise. Panic erupted in the stifling compartments. The Link 1-6 tactical data network collapsed. GPS signals were jammed and spoofed, leaving F-35Cs on deck unable to launch for fear of plunging into the dark ocean. In that moment, Americans learned a brutal truth of modern war. No matter how expensive your $13 billion steel giant or your fifth-generation fighters are, once you lose control of the electromagnetic spectrum, you become nothing more than a sitting duck waiting for the butcher's blade. And when blindness stripped away their final defenses, the Reaper's scythe descended. The quiet night sky over the Gulf was suddenly ripped open by hundreds of glowing red streaks plunging from the stratosphere. These were not slow suicide drones or easily intercepted subsonic cruise missiles. the enemy revealed their ultimate trump card. A barrage of next-generation hypersonic ballistic missiles, perfectly synchronized on unpredictable trajectories, screamed down at Mach 15. The ear-piercing shriek of hypersonic friction barely reached the deck lookouts before the ocean surface shattered. The first hypersonic projectile, carrying kinetic energy like a small meteor, punched straight through the Ford's multi-layered armor like a needle through thin plastic. A massive fireball engulfed the flight deck. The nuclear reactor core buckled under the shockwave while dozens of F-35Cs and massive ammunition stores triggered secondary explosions, turning the supercarrier into a floating inferno. Nearby, the second supercarrier suffered the same horrific fate, broken in half by devastating salvos targeting its vulnerable flanks. Its phalanx close-in weapon systems spun uselessly, firing into empty air. Thousands of highly trained sailors screamed in the flames before slipping into the black abyss along with America's shattered pride. Deep underground in Washington's Situation Room, the atmosphere was no longer that of a war operations center. It resembled a morgue for shattered illusions. The President and National Security Council stood frozen before giant screens showing fragmented, blood-colored reports. Both strike groups had gone silent. Repeat, all signals from the Fifth Fleet at Grid X have vanished. The watch officer's broken voice cut like a blade across the throats of every general present. Cold sweat poured down pale faces. The psychological shock struck too fast, too savagely, smashing every crisis scenario the Pentagon had ever rehearsed. Terror seeped into every brain cell as leaders realized America hadn't just lost two expensive warships. The disappearance of these supercarriers meant the complete loss of power, projection capability, and the total collapse of the security umbrella they had painstakingly built over the oil-rich Middle East. The empire hadn't even managed a single counterstrike before both arms were severed at the very heart of its adversary's territory. The shockwaves from those two blazing funeral pyres on the Gulf quickly transcended a local military clash and became a geopolitical tsunami shaking the regional order to its core. In Tel Aviv, Riyadh, and Abu Dhabi, confidence in their mighty American protectors shattered like broken glass. Traditional allies watched in absolute horror. A cold realization ran down their spines. If Washington's supposedly invincible steel fortresses could be sent to the bottom of the ocean by the Tehran-Moscow axis in under an hour, what hope did smaller nations have? Panic triggered the rawest survival instincts. Secret defense pacts with America suddenly became worthless scraps of paper. Emergency diplomatic channels across the Middle East worked overtime that night, not to beg Washington for help, but to reach out directly to Beijing and Moscow, desperately seeking new security guarantees and ready to make any compromise to avoid becoming the next target of hypersonic missile swarms. The geopolitical architecture America had spent decades and trillions of dollars building with blood collapsed from within. The United States had been completely vaporized from the Middle East chessboard, not just physically, but in terms of strategic credibility. Yet the brutality of multipolar warfare never stops at destroying a few pieces of hardware, no matter how massive. The eerie silence after the firestorm over the Gulf was not the end. It was the deathly calm before the second scythe swung. While Washington reeled in panic, desperately trying to salvage bloody wreckage from the ocean, they had no clue that sinking the two carriers was merely a colossal feint, a massive sacrifice move to draw all American attention, resources, and early warning systems toward the sea. From the cloud-piercing peaks of the Zagros Range to the barren deserts of Iraq and Syria, hidden silo hatches quietly opened. U.S. forward land bases across the Middle East, now stripped of the Fifth Fleet's air cover, stood naked and isolated under the night sky. The real storm, the one that would bury America's last remnants of land power, was only beginning. The black smoke from those two giant steel tombs on the Gulf hadn't even cleared before its aftershocks slammed deep inland. Tens of thousands of U.S. troops stationed at massive bases from Syria's deserts through Iraq to the Arabian Peninsula suddenly realized they were standing completely exposed in an open slaughterhouse with no roof. For decades, bases like Al-Assad had been proudly called little American kingdoms, fortresses, protected by invisible layers of absolute air superiority. Tonight, with no five seas left to contest the skies, those bases became nothing more than giant stationary targets, fat, immobile bullseyes on the eastern hunter's board. Air raid sirens wailed across the desert, tearing apart the night's silence. The dark sky above lit up not with friendly flares, but with the deep red glow of destruction raining from the stratosphere. Security cameras captured crisscrossing streaks like a deadly meteor shower before shattering into useless static. The Tehran axis, with precise targeting support from Russian GLONASS satellites and intelligence, unleashed a multi-layered saturation attack. Swarms of low-flying Shahed suicide drones exhausted air defenses, while precision ballistic missiles with cluster warheads poured down like a flood. American Patriot and THAAD systems, billion-dollar technological marvels, performed a pathetic, hopeless dance, completely suppressed by powerful Krasuka jamming from distant mountain positions, U.S. Radars saw thousands of ghost targets and wasted millions of dollars worth of interceptors on empty sky, only to stand mute as real warheads slammed into screaming troops. Meter-thick reinforced concrete bunkers were torn apart like paper. Fuel and ammunition depots erupted into towering fireballs, incinerating any remaining will to fight. This methodical massacre brutally exposed a fatal strategic delusion, a cancerous tumor in Pentagon thinking that had grown unchecked for years. They had slept too long on the victories of the Gulf War, convincing themselves that old-school conventional power and precision airstrikes would always rule the battlefield. America brought 20th century warfare concepts against a 21st century Eurasian alliance that had quietly mastered asymmetric warfare, electronic dominance, and hypersonic weapons. Arrogance blinded Washington to a razor-sharp truth. In the multipolar era, parking tens of thousands of troops in fixed bases with no mobility and total dependence on vulnerable sea, logistics was no different from slipping a noose around your own neck and handing the rope to the enemy. The Pentagon had underestimated the seamless coordination between Moscow's electronic warfare mastery and Tehran's overwhelming firepower. This conservative military doctrine was paid for in rivers of blood on the ground. Back in the underground situation room, panic had crossed into total psychological paralysis. Reports of mounting casualties arrived in fragmented bursts over failing satellite links. The president and advisors sweated profusely, hands clenched white. Supreme authority suddenly felt pathetic and meaningless. Desperate counterattack orders were shouted hoarsely. They demanded the Global Strike Command launch B-2 Spirits and B-52S from Diego Garcia and Europe to flatten Tehran. But that desperate retaliation was instantly doused by cold reality. The Director of National Intelligence, voice trembling, reported that the entire Middle East airspace was now locked down by Russian S-400 and even S-500 systems, forming an impenetrable steel dome. Any American bomber daring to enter that zone, no matter how stealthy, would be nothing more than a moth flying into a giant bug zapper. For the first time in history, the world's greatest hunter felt the burning humiliation of total inability to strike back. America was caught in a deadly vice. Fighting meant suicidal losses for its strategic air force. Doing nothing meant watching its soldiers being ground to pieces minute by minute. As always in the game of power, when the strongest begins to bleed, its followers start recalculating their own survival. The collapse of U.S. forces in the Middle East instantly tore apart the diplomatic facade of regional alliances. Wealthy Arab monarchies that had spent billions on American weapons and hosted huge bases now trembled in their golden palaces. They watched carriers vanish and patriots fail, and a chilling truth sank in. America's time was over. Herd survival instinct kicked in. When the Pentagon desperately requested airspace access for rescue operations, they received only deathly silence and polite but firm refusals. Riyadh, Abu Dhabi, and Doha closed their airspace indefinitely, citing national security and refused direct involvement. In reality, they were abandoning America to save themselves from the wrath of hypersonic missiles. The final lifelines for U.S. forces were slammed shut by their own closest allies. American troops in the Middle East became cursed islands, completely isolated in a hostile ocean, unable to advance, retreat, or call for help from above. The conflict had grown far beyond a localized war. It was mutating into a ruthless redrawing of the global power map at terrifying speed. America was being stripped of its final layers of prestige and driven into a corner of disgrace. Yet even as Washington's elite drowned in panic over the shattered Middle East front, they clung desperately to one last naive belief that the worst was confined to these deserts. They had no idea that the great Eastern art of Maskirovka never targets only one objective. Turning the Middle East into an American crematorium was merely a giant magnet sucking all of Washington's attention and resources to one side. At the exact moment the commander-in-chief slumped in despair, a secure red hotline from Indo-PACOM in Hawaii suddenly screamed with an ear-piercing alarm. The general picked up with shaking hands. The broken, horrified voice on the other end slammed shut the last door of hope. All satellite communications and radar networks covering the South China Sea, Taiwan Strait, and East China Sea had gone dark simultaneously. A massive black void appeared on America's strategic displays across the entire Far East. The giant Asian dragon had awakened and risen from the mist. A two-front war, the greatest nightmare in American military history, had stepped off the planning board into brutal reality. In every West Point or Naval War College textbook, the worst-case scenario was always highlighted in red ink: simultaneous war against two peer superpowers. The Pentagon had arrogantly dismissed it as mere theory, trusting their string of pearls bases surrounding Eurasia. Tonight, that theoretical nightmare tore through the paper and entered the real world as a multi-headed monster ready to devour the old unipolar order. While Washington's attention, intelligence, and thirst for revenge were completely drained in the bloody Middle East trap set by Putin and Tehran's leaders, Beijing played its most ruthless strategic card in the Pacific. America awoke in horror to a stark truth. The massacre in the Gulf was only a colossal feint, a massive blood-soaked lure designed to stretch Washington's global defenses to the breaking point, clearing the way for the real decapitating strike on the other side of the world. The collapse in the Pacific didn't begin with towering fireballs like in Syria. It unfolded in the terrifying quiet of battlefield domain denial. China's strategic rocket forces and PLA support units activated a continent-scale electronic warfare matrix. Dozens of Chinese anti-satellite weapons with high-powered microwaves silently closed in and fried the electronics of America's military communications and GPS satellites over Asia. Within 20 minutes, the entire tactical picture across the South China Sea, Taiwan Strait, and East China Sea was wiped clean. Massive U.S. bases in Okinawa, Guam, and South Korea fell into complete isolation, deaf, dumb, and blind, like islands waiting for a tsunami. At the same time, thousands of armed civilian militia vessels, backed by Type 055 destroyers and nuclear attack submarines, surged out to blockade every vital sea lane. Not a single shot needed to be fired. Through overwhelming spectrum dominance and sheer physical presence, Beijing established an invisible iron cage, sealing off the world's most dynamic economic region. American troops in the Far East, already stunned by the slaughter of their comrades in the Middle East, now realized the noose was tightening around their own necks. With military power broken on both oceans, the destruction shifted to geopolitical and economic fronts, triggering a massive heart attack against the entire Western financial system. The Eurasian Axis' ultimate goal had never been just sinking ships or killing soldiers. Their ambition was far colder and grander, the surgical removal of the West's economic windpipe. The oil artery through Hormuz had already been clamped shut by Iran. Now Beijing severed the microchip lifeline from Asian factories. A devastating financial tsunami began to surge. Stock indices in New York, London, and Frankfurt didn't just drop, they entered freefall. Algorithmic selling triggered at millions of transactions per second, creating an unstoppable panic cascade. Oil prices skyrocketed beyond any historical record, stabbing straight through the heart of the American economy. Defense giants like Lockheed Martin and Raytheon faced total shutdown due to Chinese export bans on rare earths and semiconductors. The very foundation of American power, using military force to protect the petrodollar and global supply chains, was being mercilessly torn apart before the eyes of the world. Alongside the collapse of the real economy, a brutal cognitive massacre was underway, shattering Western social psychology. America's once mighty propaganda machine, which had manipulated global opinion for decades, suddenly found itself powerless to contain the truth. In a masterful information warfare move, Russian and Chinese intelligence networks bypassed Washington's censorship, leaked raw, unedited footage from burning Middle East bases, and flooded every social media platform. Hundreds of millions of Americans woke up in the middle of the night to horrifying scenes of their compatriots fleeing through flames. The ghosts of Vietnam and the Kabul humiliation returned stronger, bloodier, and more traumatic than ever. Undeniable reality pierced the comfortable illusion of American society like poisoned bullets. Riots and protests demanding withdrawal and punishment of hawkish elites erupted from New York to Los Angeles. Supermarkets were looted, gas stations burned. Leaders realized they were trapped between two deadly jaws. Fighting meant total destruction by the Eurasian alliance. Retreating meant the empire would collapse from internal rage. America's own cherished freedom of the press had been weaponized against it into a perfect instrument of national suicide. In Europe, the mood in aging capitals shifted from panic to desperate herd-like survival. NATO leaders, who had obediently followed America into every sanctions campaign, now trembled at the prospect of an energy winter and paralyzed heavy industry as both Middle Eastern oil and Asian goods were cut off. The American security umbrella was exposed as the greatest scam of the century. In the darkness of despair, secret diplomatic flights left Paris and Berlin not for Washington but for Moscow and Beijing, carrying envoys begging for energy security and offering to lift sanctions and technology bans in exchange for any lifeline. The Western alliance was cracking and melting like wax before the roaring geopolitical flames from the East. Meanwhile, in BRICS nations and the global South, Arab states, India, South Africa, and others watched this historic moment with ruthless decisiveness. They accelerated de-dollarization, converting trillions in reserves to gold and the multipolar currency basket, hammering the final nails into the coffin of American financial hegemony. Every escape route for the empire had now been sealed. The cold air in Pentagon bunkers couldn't dispel the thick stench of death. America had been defeated conventionally, economically strangled, and betrayed by its closest allies. The ruling elite's clarity began to fracture, giving way to the mad ideas of cornered beasts. With conventional forces blinded and supercarriers sunk, hawks in Washington screamed for the final cursed sword strategic nuclear forces. DEFCON alerts flashed upward, pushing the world to the brink of Armageddon. But Western elites had disastrously underestimated their enemy's cold preparations. Just as the president prepared to break the glass on the nuclear football, America's NORAD early warning screens lit up with terrifying new contacts. Not from space or distant continents, but from the depths of the North Atlantic, right off America's eastern seaboard. The Eurasian axis hadn't just surrounded them from afar. They had quietly placed the Reaper's blade at the heart of the American continent. The greatest and most horrifying card of this long war was finally revealed. The cold waves of the North Atlantic had never carried such dense, black, suffocating, murderous intent. For over 2 centuries, since 1812, America had deluded itself with a geographic religion that two vast oceans formed eternal natural walls, a divine shield making the North American fortress immune to old world wars. Tonight, that grand illusion was ripped to shreds without mercy. The shrieking of underwater sonar early warning systems signaled not just stealthy machines, but the death knell for America's final pride. Rising from the deepest Atlantic trenches, stealthy Russian Bory-class ballistic missile submarines and the massive Belgorod crept toward New York and Washington. Less than 200 nautical miles offshore, they didn't need to fire a single torpedo or missile to spread terror. Simply penetrating America's legendary anti-submarine barriers through the GIUK gap with ease was a resounding slap across NORAD's face. The nightmare was no longer a distant intelligence report. It stood right at the front door, its tubes loaded with hundreds of nuclear warheads and Poseidon doomsday torpedoes aimed at the heart of the Western economy and political system. The ruthless coordination between Moscow and Beijing was now crystal clear. They had deliberately drawn American submarine hunters and naval air forces into the Middle East and Pacific traps, creating a fatal gap on America's eastern flank, then slowly sliding this icy scalpel to Washington's throat. A decapitation strike was no longer theory, it was counting down by the second. Inside Raven Rock and the White House Situation Room bunkers, designed to survive the worst attacks, the air was freezing, trembling, and reeking of death like a cursed tomb. Psychological pressure had shattered every limit of human endurance, turning the world's most powerful minds into trembling dreamers in a living nightmare. The president and generals stood frozen before giant radar screens showing red blips hugging the eastern coast. A submarine-launched ballistic missile from that range would reach Washington in under 7 minutes. 7 minutes, not enough for evacuation, not enough for hesitation. Internal divisions exploded into a vicious verbal civil war. Hawks pounded tables, demanding DEFCON 1, an immediate nuclear release, screaming that America must prove it would rather burn the planet to ash than lose its throne. But the few remaining clear-headed strategists pointed out an even more horrifying truth. Any nuclear attempt now would not be a heroic first strike, but collective national suicide. Half of America's nuclear triad was already neutralized. Land-based Minuteman silos were locked by enemy satellites. B-2 bombers were grounded. Ohio-class submarines were being hunted elsewhere. In contrast, the Moscow-Beijing axis had anticipated everything. Their S-500 space defense networks, high-altitude interceptors, and ICBMs like Sarmat and DF-41 were at maximum readiness. The risk of miscalculation hung over humanity by a single hair. Fear of losing command and control turned American commanders into men sitting on a live bomb with no off switch. They realized they were trapped inside their own megalomania. When news of the Russian submarine fleet off the coast leaked through open source intelligence and uncensored social media, North American society collapsed with horrifying speed. Far beyond worst sociological predictions, the crisis of faith became poison eating America from within. Financial markets didn't just crash, they evaporated. The SEC desperately tried to unplug systems, but underground trading and international capital flight turned the dollar into worthless paper by the minute. Hyperinflation exploded overnight, wiping out lifetimes of savings for the middle class. Martial law was declared. National Guard armored vehicles blocked intersections, but were quickly swallowed by tens of millions of panicked citizens looting supermarkets, smashing gas stations, and fighting for water and medicine while fleeing westward. Interstate highways turned into endless parking lots of despair where jungle law replaced the Constitution. Citizens cursed the ruling elite safe hundreds of meters underground while sending 40,000 troops and hundreds of millions of civilians into the abyss purely for the arrogant dream of global dominance. America was tearing itself apart and self-immolating before the enemy even needed to fire the final shot. This apocalyptic momentum tore apart the remaining rules-based international order created by the West. In Europe, the betrayal was completed with legal finality. Seeing America's capital under nuclear guns and the continent descending into riots, key NATO pillars like France, Germany, and Italy officially abandoned their ally. They realized clinging to Washington was like hugging a millstone while jumping into the abyss. Emergency calls between European leaders produced a ruthless decision: unilateral, indefinite suspension of all mutual defense treaties with America. At NATO headquarters in Brussels, flags were lowered in silence. Instead, envoys flew secretly to Moscow and Beijing with surrender-like agreements: lift all sanctions, transfer technology, pay for energy in rubles and yuan, close American bases in Europe, anything for a chance to survive. The nearly century-old Western alliance did not collapse under explosives, but under the rot and cowardice of lost faith when facing death. America was left utterly alone, abandoned by the world like a plague. Military, economic, social, and diplomatic pressure crushed America into a singularity with no escape. The red lines Washington once used arrogantly against others had become the rope tightening around its own neck. The choice in the Situation Room was no longer fight or negotiate, it was how the empire would die. Press the nuclear button and turn North America into a radioactive wasteland, or surrender, withdraw completely, and sign its own obituary as a second-tier, isolated, and impoverished nation. Bunker air grew thick enough to choke on. Only the president's ragged breathing and the ticking of the doomsday clock could be heard. The nuclear football lay open, its red keyboard light casting ghostly glows on ashen faces. Judgment hour had arrived, and at that razor's edge of life and death, as the president's trembling finger hovered over the button, the secure red hotline to the Kremlin and Zhongnanhai suddenly lit up with a long, piercing tone. A final message had arrived. The Reaper's scythe had reached its apex. The encrypted voice line, once the ultimate symbol of Cold War balance, carried a sentence of steel into the last remnants of the empire. The technicians decoded the signal. The voice on the other end was not angry shouting or Western-style bluster. Vladimir Putin's calm, synchronized with the Chinese leadership's message, spoke with icy, emotionless precision like a frozen scalpel slicing through Washington's nervous system. There were no negotiations, no concessions, no diplomatic off ramps, only a merciless ultimatum and a naked picture of reality. Every S-500 system, space surveillance network, SARMAT, ICBM, and Chinese DF-41 had locked onto American silos and strategic air bases. The Boreas submarines in the Atlantic had coordinates for every major city loaded. The cold ultimatum made it clear. If America touched the nuclear button, it would automatically trigger a pre-programmed chain reaction, ensuring the permanent vaporization of the entire North American continent from the map of humanity. The Eurasian Axis had anticipated the cornered beast's desperation and placed the gun barrel against Washington's temple long before it realized it was being executed. When the final verdict from the East slammed into the center of American power, it unleashed a geopolitical tsunami, forcing the entire world into an unprecedented phase of decisive polarization. The gray zone, where small nations once balanced between superpowers, was erased. The sword of reality had drawn a blood-soaked line dividing the globe. The price of choosing the wrong side was no longer sanctions, it was the survival of entire peoples. A great, shameful, and humiliating exodus in international relations began. The global South, led by BRICS, no longer hid its ambition to bury the old order. India, Brazil, South Africa, and neutral nations declared national emergencies, froze American corporate assets, cut off critical mineral supplies, and imposed counter-sanctions. They refused diplomatic flights from Washington, closed embassies, and openly signed comprehensive security pacts with the Moscow-Beijing axis. America, once the dispenser of global rules, was now chased away by the world like a plague carrier. Soft power, the ideological weapon America had long used to manipulate the globe, was burned in the furnace of centuries-old resentment and the hunger for independence. The most violent aftershock hit the Middle East, where the last loyal allies of Western democracy faced imminent death. In Tel Aviv, the loss of the Fifth Fleet and American bases left Israel completely naked, surrounded by a boiling ocean of vengeful enemies. Israeli leaders felt the bone-chilling cold of absolute solitude for the first time. Their Samson option, the ultimate nuclear suicide deterrent, had been neutralized by Russia's massive electronic warfare blanket over the region. Unable to call American air power or launch strategic weapons, the nation stood at the edge of existential annihilation, facing destruction within hours under Iranian hypersonic fire and proxy forces. Israel's elite swallowed their pride and secretly sent delegations to the Kremlin, offering total concessions, territorial compromises, dismantling defenses in exchange for a promise not to be wiped out. The psychological surrender of a nation that once called itself the Middle East fortress sent the coldest message yet. America's symbols of power had truly disintegrated. No one could survive by clinging to the dying shadow of the Pentagon. The next blow was the fatal strike against the Western financial system. As military fear peaked, the global economy reacted with apocalyptic panic. BRICS, exploiting America's paralysis before nuclear guns, launched a new gold and commodities-backed international payment system, collapsing SWIFT and turning the petrodollar into worthless trash. Trillions of dollars fled reserves back to America like a reverse tidal wave. Hyperinflation exploded, shattering every economic chart and wiping out savings, pensions, and assets in hours. Defense giants cut off from Asian chips, and capital declared bankruptcy overnight. America could no longer produce weapons or even buy bread for its citizens. The empire that once strangled small nations with sanctions was now convulsing in its own cage of hyperinflation, debt, and shattered trust. Inside the deep bunkers, the external collapse of the world order pressed down like a physical weight. The four-star general's wall of pride finally crumbled, revealing weak, selfish, and cowardly human nature before annihilation. Arguments turned into sobs and choked curses. They understood that crossing the nuclear threshold now meant pressing the button to end civilization. The Poseidon torpedoes lurking offshore would create radioactive tsunamis hundreds of meters high. Sarmat missiles would turn the land to radioactive dust. The Eurasian Axis had not given them the right to strike back, only the right to choose how to kneel. The air was so thick it felt like it could be cut. Every bloodshot, terrified eye focused on the trembling hands hovering over the nuclear football keyboard. A century of hegemony, trillions of dollars, and countless lives compressed into the millimeters between a fingertip and the red button. The Eastern ultimatum echoed coldly through the speakers, counting down the final seconds of American pride. Judgment hour gripped the empire's throat. The fate of billions now hung on a single breath. The countdown numbers from the bunker speakers were no longer measurements of physical time, but hammer blows driving the final nail into the coffin of American hegemony. In that moment, when all human history compressed into a suffocating space reeking of sweat and death, silence itself became the cruelest psychological torture. The commander of the planet's mightiest military, a man who once held the power of life and death over billions, was now nothing more than a pale, trembling wax statue before the open nuclear football. In those few seconds, a razor-sharp, ice-cold realization pierced Washington's ingrained arrogance. If that finger pressed down, there would be no great patriotic war, no heroic epics. It would simply be the act of personally opening the gates of hell to swallow 300 million fellow citizens into a radioactive ocean, while the enemy, protected by S-500 networks and layered interceptors, stood ready with an invisible shield to catch any final desperate flailing. For the first time in nearly a century as the world's greatest hunter, America bitterly realized it had become the prey. Lying helpless on the butcher's block, even denied the right to die with glory. The cold countdown continued, indifferent as geopolitics itself. Then, with a deep, soul-crushing sigh that collapsed an entire century of dominance, the president's hands slowly dropped away from the fateful keyboard. He slumped forward onto the cold metal table, hiding the tears of national humiliation. The stand-down order was issued in a hoarse, broken voice over the failing communication systems. The wheel of unipolar destiny had officially jammed and shattered into irreparable fragments. America had blinked. The fear of total annihilation had crushed the pride of a superpower that once believed it stood above all morality. An unconditional surrender order was encrypted and sent back over the red line to the Kremlin and Zhongnanhai. It was not signed under television lights, but in darkness, a total, humiliating capitulation in exchange for the survival of the North American continent. There was no triumphant cheering on the other end, only cold confirmation from the victors. The Eurasian strategic minds had played a game of the century with calm and ruthless brilliance. Under the cold waves of the North Atlantic, the massive shadows of Russian Borai and Belgorod submarines lowered their periscopes and silently slipped back into the abyss, withdrawing the doomsday blade from America's eastern shore. But the withdrawal brought no relief. It left a permanent psychological scar in the American subconscious. The North American fortress had been breached. Invulnerability was exposed as a historical lie. At the same time, in the Middle East and isolated Pacific bases, enemy electronic warfare networks briefly opened a narrow channel so U.S. commanders could receive the order to lay down arms from the Pentagon. There was no heroic last stand. Tens of thousands of American troops, once proud elites in the uniform of the world's #1 power, now shuffled out of ruined bunkers with heads bowed, raising pathetic white flags. They agreed to a humiliating withdrawal. The Eurasian Axis allowed them to keep their lives for evacuation, but on one condition of absolute disgrace: they must board civilian aircraft empty-handed. All military hardware, pristine F-35s that never flew. Patriot systems and servers containing billions of dollars worth of classified intelligence had to be left behind as trophies for the victors. International cameras, now free of Pentagon censorship, captured the full shameful scene. Columns of American soldiers marching with downcast eyes under the cold gaze of enemy troops and proxies. This historic retreat was far more tragic and humiliating than the helicopters leaving Saigon rooftops or the chaos at Kabul airport. In the Persian Gulf, the smoking wreck of the USS Gerald R. Ford was towed by Iranian vessels into Bandar Abbas, turning the greatest symbol of American naval power into a public exhibit of Western paper tiger humiliation. When the guns finally fell silent, the final economic blow reshaped global financial power forever. The next morning, as dawn rose over the world's prosperous cities, financial markets opened into a completely alien reality. On the New York Stock Exchange, screens no longer danced with green and red numbers. The entire system was frozen indefinitely under martial law. The U.S. dollar, once the supreme weapon that allowed Washington to export inflation and enslave poorer economies, had officially become worthless paper. The BRIC system, guided by the Moscow-Beijing axis, launched its new multipolar payment network backed by gold, oil, gas, and critical minerals. Trillions in dollar reserves from the global south were dumped like toxic waste, triggering a hyperinflationary tidal wave that drowned America. Silicon Valley tech giants and defense behemoths like Lockheed Martin and Boeing collapsed overnight due to severed Asian supply chains. America, once able to print money to buy the world, was thrown back into a financial stone age, unable to import necessities, maintain domestic logistics, or stop bloody riots over food across all 50 states. The geopolitical consequences of Washington's surrender created a domino effect that demolished every Western alliance built over 8 decades. In Europe, NATO was quietly dissolved. Major continental powers like Germany, France, and Italy, terrified by the display of Eurasian power, executed a historic U-turn. Transatlantic security treaties were torn up without mercy. European leaders lined up in Moscow and Beijing to sign comprehensive concession agreements, accepting integration into the Belt and Road and Eurasian energy networks to save their freezing economies. In the Far East, the collapse of the American security umbrella made Taiwanese resistance futile. A forced but peaceful unification agreement was signed rapidly, returning the Taiwan Strait to full Beijing control without a single bullet fired. In the Middle East, Israel and Gulf states accepted a new security architecture sponsored by Russia and China, with borders and rules redrawn entirely by the victors. A new world had taken shape in which America was no longer the global policeman, but pushed to the margins of civilization, an isolated fortress left to gnaw on its own wounds amid internal division and hatred. History is a cold, merciless judge that never forgives hypocrisy and megalomania. From the opening moves in this grand confrontation to the trembling finger leaving the nuclear button, the Pentagon had exposed an eternal bitter truth. Hegemony never lasts forever. Blindness, self-delusion, conservative military thinking, and reckless use of sanctions and force by the West had dug their own massive collective grave. The Eastern Alliance, through superior strategic intelligence, masterful deception, and ice-cold patience, achieved a spectacular reversal. Those who once thought America was invincible learned through blood-soaked reality that when the giants of Eurasia roared together and tightened the noose in a multi-domain life or death game, even the eagle could only fold its wings, lose its fangs, and collapse in utter disgrace. A new dawn is rising over the multipolar sky, bringing new rules and a new order no longer dictated by Washington's gun barrels. But for America, it marks the beginning of a long, dark, cold night of punishment with no end in sight. Thank you for holding your breath and accompanying War Satellite through all 6 parts of this breathtaking, brutal, and historic grand scenario. If you've seen the raw underbelly of global power games, the ruthlessness of modern warfare, and felt the seismic shifts in geopolitical currents through this fiery commentary, please don't hesitate to leave sharp comments sharing your views. Hit like, share, and especially subscribe right now. Those interactions are precious ammunition and vital fuel for us to keep loading rounds and sharpening our lens to bring you even more hard-hitting, shocking geopolitical breakdowns in the future. The multipolar era has officially begun, and conflict on the world chessboard will never sleep again. Goodbye for now, and see you at the next life and death hotspots on the global map. Yeah,